So guys, we are at the beginning, the second week of a series called Waiting in Babylon, thus the waiting question, right? Now last week, Aaron kicked off this series. Aaron was with us, who is the college pastor from our Fairfax Mother Church, and he was here teaching, and he kicked off the Waiting in Babylon, and man, was that a convicting thing that he shared. His whole message surrounded this question of, do you believe that God is really in control and working for our good? I mean, that was the premise of his whole thing. And the reality is most of the time we don't even confront that question. We don't even ask it because we think we're in control. We think that we are in control of our lives and in control of what we do and in control of our days. And then all of a sudden things like hurricanes happen and things like shootings and things like political unrest and things like traffic happen, and all of a sudden we realize that we are not in control at all and are confronted with this question: if we're not in control, then who is? Is God in control? And if he is in control, is he working for our good? Is he really doing all of these things? Are all of these things actually happening, and God still is for us? And God still loves us. And so Aaron did an awesome job sort of talking about that topic. And if you want to check that topic out, if you want to learn more about that, if you want to listen in depth to what Aaron said, you can check it out at clarksburgchurch.com. We actually put all of our sermons up online there. So if you miss a week, you can still tune in and find out what happened and what he had to say about that whole thing. So this week, we are actually again talking about waiting. How long did you have to wait for something? In our lives, we have all experienced this time where we've had to wait. I heard somebody say, I never wait for anything, I leave, right? And that is an option too. You could just leave, but typically we've all been in a position, whether it's for a doctor's appointment or maybe some bigger things, like waiting for a season of life to change, waiting for a job to end, waiting for a relationship to happen, right? We've all waited for something. And sometimes we felt stuck in this place of waiting, and we're not really sure, what am I supposed to do, and how is this all supposed to come together? Well, the Israelites were no exception. They were a group of people that ended up in this place where they didn't expect to end up, and they got stuck there, and they were waiting and didn't know what to do. And God had a very specific thing to tell them. He said, hey, instead of sitting around and twiddling your thumbs, I want you to get rooted. Life is about to get rough, so you need to get rooted. You need to dig in. And know that however rough it gets, however much you feel the discomfort, know that God is with you. And so that's where we're going today. For me, I was thinking about this waiting question, and one of the things that came to mind was, it was about 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, this season, right now, this season, the fall season, I was a teacher in the inner city Indianapolis public school systems. And because of some different events, I actually had to quit my job. And it put me into a tailspin where I felt like I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I was doing in life. Everything in me said, run and hide, and so I did. I pretty much locked myself in my apartment, and I started sewing t-shirts together to make quilts because that's the only thing I could figure out to do. I also binge watched Law & Order SVU from season 1 to whatever the season was that they were at 10 years ago. I think they're on 20 now, so it was like 1 to 10. It was significant because they didn't have Netflix then. This was a unique thing I was doing. And so this is all that I could figure out to do. And so for 11 months, I felt lost, and I wandered, and I didn't know what I was doing with my life, and I was a mess, and I couldn't leave the house, and it was bad. It was bad. And it's funny, when I look back at that time, I know that to me it felt like wandering. To me it felt like darkness and chaos. And yet I look back and I see how God was strategically using every step along the way. Every feeling of like this is too much pain and too much shame and too much all randomness, and God was using all that pain and all that shame and all that randomness, and he was about to redeem it. Because I see now how every piece sort of fell in line to bring me to the storyline to find myself here in this place right now. You see, in those moments, we think that this is aimless. But God is saying, no. I got your back. I know where you're going. I know what I'm doing. The process felt to me like wasted time. And yet God was strengthening my faith in a big way to get me ready to face some big challenges. Now, we've all been there. We've all been to these places where we think we know where we're going. We think we have this path all figured out. We think we've got this understood and nailed down, and we get it. And then all of a sudden, we look up and realize that we've arrived somewhere that we didn't mean to arrive, or we didn't intend to be there. And we're not sure how to respond, and so we don't know what to do. And for all of us, it's been different situations. For some of us, it's a job. For some of us, it's a relationship. For some of us, it's a location, like a city. For others, it's a stage of life. And we get to these places and we're just like, I don't really know what to do with this. There's this common thread for all of us, all of these stories. We've sort of left the safety and comfort of what we knew, and we've kind of left that safe space, but we haven't yet arrived at the new space. We haven't yet figured out this new thing, and so we're sort of stuck in this in-between, and sometimes we were forced to leave the safety space. We were forced. We just aged out of it. We were forced. We were fired from the job. We were forced. We were deployed somewhere else. And sometimes it's because of something that we did that we got forced out, and sometimes it's just happened. Other times, it's not that we were forced out, but we chose to leave that safe space. We said, no, it's a really good idea. I'm going to take this daring step, and I'm going to leave the safety and my comfort zone, and I'm going to go somewhere new, and I have no idea how this is going to pan out, but this is the great step to take. And then we catch our breath, and we look up and realize, this is a terrible place to be. I have made a terrible decision. Because what you're feeling in that moment is discomfort and pain and fear and trauma and unknowing uncertainty. And you don't really know how to respond or what to do next. Now, a lot of times, we don't have language to describe this place. So we feel all the emotions of angst, and we feel all the emotions of pain and uncertainty, but we don't really have words to say why we feel that way or how to describe what we're feeling. And I'm so thankful in that moment for people who are much smarter than I am and writers who can articulate things. And so there's this guy, his name is Richard Rohr, and he describes that space this way. He calls it liminal space. He says liminal space, the place of waiting. It's a unique spiritual position where human beings hate to be, but where the biblical God is always leading them. It's where you have left the tried and true, but you have not yet been able to replace it with anything else. It's when you're between your old comfort zone and any possible new answer. If you're not trained in how to hold anxiety, how to live with ambiguity, how to entrust and wait, you will run. Anything to flee this terrible cloud of unknowing. Now, some of you might get caught up in the phrase liminal space, and you may be like, that's a fancy word. I don't experience no liminal space, right? That's okay. If you've ever had the feeling of wanting to run, of wanting to hide, of wanting to bury yourself under the covers until everything is different, then you know liminal space. You know what that feels like. You just want to run. Now, in the context of the Israelites, they felt this feeling too. They felt this feeling. And there was this guy who God spoke to. His name was Jeremiah. And he oftentimes heard words from the Lord that the Lord then said, you need to tell all the people. You need to go to Israel, tell all of the people the things that I am telling you. And so it was Jeremiah who wrote this verse that we find in Jeremiah 29:11. Now, even if you're not a Bible reader, chances are you've probably seen or read this verse before because it's often penned on really beautiful pictures and posters. And so maybe you saw it and it looked something like this. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. And I love the picture that's there, right? It's so cute. It's like there's one road, and like just follow that road. Like just that one road, keep going. It's perfect and it's serene and it's peaceful and it's beautiful. There's no wild animals anywhere. Like just keep walking. You're going to be fine. And the interesting thing about this verse being on a poster that looks like this is that this was not the context in which Jeremiah spoke these words. The context was totally different. You see, the real context in which Jeremiah was writing these words was that the people of Israel, perhaps you remember the story of Moses, and he parts the Red Sea, and then they wander around in the desert, and God keeps telling them, I'm going to give you a promised land, I'm going to give you a promised land, I'm going to give you this great land. And finally, after years and years and years, they arrive in this great land. They set up a nation. They become a people. And in this nation, God says, hey, here's how I want you to live because you're going to be my people and I'm going to bless you with so many different things. I have all these promises for you. And the Israelites are like, yeah, promises. We love that idea. And so they're willing to follow God and they're willing to do what he says. And they start living their lives in that way as a nation and as a people. But after time, they kind of turn away from God. Their hearts start saying no to God. And so instead of following his commands and following his decrees and worshiping him alone, the people start saying, okay, well, we want God to bless us, but we also want these other gods to bless us too. So let's worship both gods. Like, this is going to be great. And so they start doing the practices of the people that surrounded them. They start worshiping both gods. They start sacrificing their children to these other gods. And God's like, no. That's not who I've called you to be. That's not what it looks like to be my people. And so he tries to get their attention. He says, no, turn away. Turn away from those false gods. Turn away from those false gods. And the people kind of said, I don't know that I really want to. I mean, you're an okay God, but I like this one too. And it was more than that. It wasn't just that they started worshiping gods. It was also that God had been really clear about his people taking care of the people on the margins, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants. That his people were going to be a people who took care of the people who were in the most vulnerable situations. And the leaders didn't follow that, and the people didn't follow that. And so there were terrible social injustices that began to happen in this nation that God said was my nation. And so God said, you've got to stop. You've got to turn around. You have to change. You need to be different. You're supposed to be my people. And the people said, but we kind of like living the way that we are living. And so finally, God speaks to this guy, Jeremiah, and he tells Jeremiah, you need to go to the people and say, if they don't turn around, if they don't turn back to me, if they don't put their hearts in a yes position to me, then I'm going to have to destroy this nation because you're not actually helping people. You're not actually doing good. And so I can't keep letting you hurt all of these people, and so I have to put an end to this. So I'm going to allow this neighboring enemy to come in and destroy you. And so Jeremiah tells them, and they're like, yeah, that's a good thought, but that's not really going to happen. And so they just continue. And Jeremiah goes to them again and again and again and again. And he does all these strange things to try to get their attention. Aaron told us one of them, which is where he walked around with a yoke, like a oxen yoke on his shoulders, trying to tell the people, listen, you got to change. There was one prophet, not Jeremiah, a different one, that laid on his side for a whole year. Like, can you imagine the bed sores of laying on your side for a whole year and trying to communicate, you've got to return to God, and the people did not listen. And so finally, God allowed that neighboring enemy to come. And the neighboring enemy came and conquered the Israelites. And they took many of the people who were considered leaders, the politicians, the skilled workers, the highly educated. Instead of killing all of them, they said, no, we want you to be a part of our country. So they took them and they captured them and they brought them back to Babylon, miles and miles and miles away from what was home. And they took them and they didn't enslave them. They didn't force them to do particular work. They just said, no, now you live here. you live here, and you live here, and do what you do here. You may not go home. And so these Israelites, these exiled people, now find themselves in a place where they didn't know the language, they didn't know the culture, they didn't know the land, they didn't know how to get food. In this new land, they probably had to grow all new food in totally different ways. They didn't know anyone, they didn't know where to get water, and here they are in this space. Now, what made it worse was that there was this guy named Hananiah who called himself a prophet. He said, hey, I've heard a message from the Lord, and he stands up in front of the people and he says, hey, don't worry, we're only going to be gone for 2 years. Don't worry, just 2 years. Just sit around, wait 2 years, we're going to be fine. Unfortunately, Jeremiah comes and he says, listen, Hananiah, I hope that is true. And then almost immediately God speaks to Jeremiah and says, no, he's a liar. Tell everybody he's lying. And so Jeremiah stands up and is like, Hananiah, you're going to die. You're lying. It's not going to be 2 years, guys. We're going to be here for 70 years. We're going to be in this place where we know no one and nothing for 70 years. And it's in the middle of this context where Jeremiah writes this letter. And he says this in this beautiful, tranquil poster. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. This is not a picture of the context that Jeremiah spoke through. It looked much more like this. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And so even though so often we think of these words in a picture like this, oftentimes the context that this is spoken into looks more like this. You can go to the next one. And even though, do you have the other picture? And even though we want our lives to look like this, oftentimes these words are spoken into our lives when our life looks more like this. And even though we hear these words and we want it to be in a place where we feel like this, oftentimes these words are spoken into our life when we feel much more like this. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. While God has good plans for you when you're sitting in the sunshine and on the beach, it's in the middle of darkness and despair and uncertainty and that waiting space, that liminal space that feels so uncomfortable, that feels like you just want to run and hide, that God speaks these words to you. I have a plan for you. This isn't just aimless wandering. This isn't just aimless waiting around. I have a plan for your life. And so even though everything in you says run and hide, I have a plan for you. This story is not over. There is an end that is beautiful. There is more to come. I am moving behind the scenes to bring you a hope and a future. And then Jeremiah shares the end. He shares with them in this letter right after verse 11, he shares with them, then you will call on me and pray to me and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. And I will be found by you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back from captivity. Even in the waiting, God is with you. Even in the waiting, when it seems like darkness and uncertainty, God is listening. He has found you. He is gathering you up and waiting to bring you to a new place and a new home. Your darkness that seems pitch black is not dark to God. Your mystery that seems so uncertain and confusing is not mystery to God. The surprises that have come up in your life are not surprises to God. He knows the plans that he has for you, and he is with you in the waiting. He is with you. God knows what he is doing, and even though it seems like aimless, wasted waiting, God is concerned with bringing you home. But the question then becomes is how do we wait? Right? Richard Rohr says the problem is we don't know how to hold anxiety. We don't know how to sit with patience. We don't know how to wait. And if we don't know how to do those things, we will run. And we will run from the things that God is trying to desperately bring into our lives, to bring us into and to transform us. And so how do we wait? You see, there's actually a very big difference between waiting for something that's going to happen quickly and waiting for something that may take a really long time to happen. And I learned this when I took my girls to 2 car repair appointments. One was I had to go to Jiffy Lube, and we had to get the oil changed. And I think that at some point in my lifetime, Jiffy Lube was the home of the 15-minute oil change. And so I was like, yes, 15 minutes. Let's get it done. And it just so happened that we had to get the oil changed right before we went on vacation. So I was even like, we are going to leave vacation from the Jiffy Lube oil change place. And so everything in me wanted for this to go quickly. So I'm like, 15 minutes, this is going to be great. So I have my girls, but I don't bring any snacks. I don't bring any games. Don't bring any shows. There's nothing because it's going to be 15 minutes. That may not have happened. But that's how I prepared for a short wait. You can be bored. You can twiddle your thumbs. You can just sit there and look at the ceiling. You're going to be fine. Figure it out. You're fine. But there was another time that we had to get a car repaired, and there was no one to come and pick us up. We were just going to have to sit there for hours, maybe the whole day, in order to get this car repaired. And so I prepared. I knew my girls were going to be with me, so I packed so much food. Jazzy snacks is what we call them when they need to be fun snacks, not just like carrot sticks and applesauce, right? Jazzy snacks. And so I packed all the jazzy snacks. I packed all the games and the coloring books. When we arrived at the car dealership to get the car fixed, I set up camp. I was like, here's the blanket. We're going to sit here. Don't touch the floor. Be on the blanket. This is the game, and now let's play this game. Right? I was prepared for the long haul. There's a totally different posture that we take when we think that something is going to come quickly and we don't have to wait for very long. And the posture that we take when it's going to be a long time. And we're going to be waiting around. And this is exactly what Jeremiah is trying to communicate to the exiled people. He's saying, listen, this isn't going to be 2 years. This is going to be 70 years. So here's some instructions about how you're going to wait. Here's some instructions about how you're going to hold the anxiety and the tension of not really wanting to be here. And so in verse 5 through 7, this is what he says. He says, build houses. He says, this is the message from God. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your kiddos. Wait, go back. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. You all thought that I had that memorized, right? Like I'm always like just looking out in space and saying it. No. He continues. He says, increase in number. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city in which you have been carried into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. For if they prosper, you too will prosper. God's message to the Israelites through Jeremiah is, listen, life is about to get really rough. You're going to be stuck. It's going to be uncomfortable. But what I want you to do is I want you to get rooted. I want you to dig into this city. I want you to cultivate the soil. Soil cultivation takes a long time. I want you to figure out how to grow stuff. I don't want you to wait to get married. Don't think, well, I'll just postpone it till next year. Next year's a better calendar season. No. Get married because you're here for the long haul. Dig in, seek the welfare of the city, get involved with the politics, figure out how to make things better, pray for your city, dig in and get rooted, get settled. So what do we do when we're stuck in this liminal waiting space that scares the pants off of us? We put down roots. We get invested. We get engaged. Literally and figuratively. Just popped into my head. This totally contradicts our culture, though. Our culture says, hey, if you have a job that you don't like, find a new one. If you have a spouse that you are no longer in love with, get a divorce. If you don't like the location or neighborhood that you live in, move out. Change, jump ship. Leave that space. Now, for some of us, that might be the right call. That might be actually the very thing that God is calling you to. But oftentimes, we don't leave because God called us to leave. We leave because it's uncomfortable. We leave because we're no longer happy. We leave because we don't really like it. It doesn't feel good, and so we run. But when we run, we often run from some sort of transformation that God is trying to make happen in that place. And so if you find yourself in a city that you don't really like, or maybe you're only here for 18 months, God's call is to start picking up trash. God's call is to start getting involved in the legislation. God's call is investing yourself in some local business. For you, maybe it's a neighborhood that you're like, I don't want to be in this neighborhood. I dislike this place. I want to move as soon as my lease is up. And God's saying, yeah, but while you're waiting, figure out the names of your neighbors. While you're waiting, clean up your yard. While you're waiting, host a block party. Maybe for you, it's your job. And you're like, I don't like this job. It sucks the life out of me. And God's like, great, but while you're waiting, eat lunch with your coworkers. While you're waiting, write thank you notes to your employees. While you're waiting, pray for your boss. Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe every interaction is a challenge for you. And you want out. But God's saying, nah, serve your spouse. Start going on dates again. Talk to each other even though it's hard. Fight for your relationship. Or maybe for you, it's your relationship with your kids where they don't even want to talk to you. Every interaction is this massive eye roll. Ah! And God says, no. Get rooted in that relationship. Settle in. Ask questions about who they are. Engage in their interests. Show up over and over and over again, even though it's met with this, no, go away. Engage and get rooted. In the middle of the storm, God is calling us. In the middle of the uncertainty, in the middle of waiting, in the middle of that liminal space that you just want to run from, God is saying you need to create roots. When life gets rough, you dig in and get rooted. We seek the welfare of whatever location that we find ourselves in, whatever relationships we find ourselves in the middle of. We pray for those relationships. We fight for those relationships. We dig in. Now, I know that in the middle of that, it's all easy to say those things, but I know that feeling of, yeah, but nothing's going to change. My job will still be soul-sucking. This relationship will still just be an argument every time. I know it feels that way. I know that it feels like it doesn't matter and it's not going to make a difference. But it will. See, my brother-in-law, he makes mead. Does anybody know what mead is? Because I didn't know what mead was. It's an alcoholic beverage that you ferment. You take water and honey and some spices and grains or fruits, you stick it in a barrel, it sits there for ages, and then boom, here it comes. Now, I do not like this at all. I think it tastes horrible. I'm just not a drinker. I just never got into that. And he loves it though. And he makes this stuff, and he's always talking about how this one tastes this way, and this one tastes this way. And I don't really care. He talks too long about all the details of all of it. But the thing that is really fascinating to me is the fermentation process. Because essentially what you've done is you've taken like honey water and you've stuck it in a barrel and it just sits there. And like it looks and seems like nothing has changed. Nothing is changing. It's just sitting. It's just being present with itself. It's just hanging out. And maybe every once in a while there's a slight bubble that comes to the surface. But that's it. But then all of a sudden, after this time, after a long period of time, you take it out, and it is nothing like the honey water that it started as. It is something altogether different. That is patient fermentation. And that in our rootedness, in the liminal space, in those waiting places of our lives, that's what we are called to do. To be patiently fermenting. And even when it looks like nothing is changing, we trust that God is working behind the scenes. God is working for our good. God is working to transform the places that we exist in. God is working to transform us as we engage and are rooted deeply in the places that we are at. So what does it look like for you in your life, in your context, in your liminal space? What does it look like for you to get rooted? What is the call that God is telling you and calling you to? What does it look like for when the questions of, is this really going to matter, to just be like, no, patient fermentation, I am staying present. I am staying in this. Because here's the truth. God stayed present with each one of us. And even when it seemed like nothing was changing, God said, no, I'm staying present. Even when we were in this no position, even when we, like the Israelites, were disregarding all of the things that we were supposed to be doing and worshiping other things and going after other pursuits, God said, no, I'm going to stay patient with you. I'm going to stay rooted with you. And he sets up this whole timeline that in hundreds of years after Jeremiah gives them this word, Jesus steps onto the scene. And an angel declares that his name is to be Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so in these spaces of waiting, these spaces of uncertainty, God is present. He is staying rooted with us. Now, we're going to sing a song in response today. And can you put up the song lyrics for that next song? The first verse of this says, I look to God, I won't be overwhelmed. Give me vision to see things like you do. God, I look to you. You're where my help comes from. Give me wisdom to know just what to do. In this song that we're going to sing, guys, I want this song to be the cry of your heart. That if you find yourself in this space that I'm describing, there are times in our lives where we all go through this, but some of us are in the middle of it right now. And so if we find ourselves in this space right now, I want to invite you to cry out to God, to look to him, and have him show you the way he sees things, because you may see things as total darkness. But he says, no. I have a plan for you. I know what I'm doing. We're going in a direction, even though it feels really confusing right now. And so I invite you to cry out to God. And for some of you, it might be the first time that you've ever cried out to God. May today be the day that you do that. Would you pray with me? Father God, I thank you for the stories of old that teach us anew your character and who you are, that you have not let us alone, that we are not the only ones to be in the space that we find ourselves in today. Father, would your presence, would your rootedness in us be a great comfort? Would we cry out to you? Would you teach us how to hold the anxiety? Would you teach us how to trust? Would you teach us how to be present in the uncertain things in our lives, in the places where things just didn't turn out how we expected them to? Father, we look to you. We look to you to bring comfort, to bring life. We trust you to bring redemption. Would you hear the cries of our hearts this morning? We pray this in your holy and precious name.